Well, hello everyone, and welcome to our week 3 of Leadership and Management. I am hoping that you are enjoying the class so far and finding some of these concepts, theories useful and applicable for you personally as also professionally. So let's get started with this week's lecture. So for this week, we have the following readings, chapter 6 in the Van Wart textbook. Then we have chapters 4, 5, 6, and 7 in the Doble textbook. So both of these speak to the importance of ethics-based leadership. What is ethics-based leadership? What are some of the leadership values that comprise ethics-based leadership? The importance of unethical behavior, or I should say the dangers of unethical behavior and ethical slippage. Okay, what happens when we don't act ethically and we slip as managers, but as leaders more importantly. So these are the readings for this week. Then you have, for this week, we have a series of videos, and this week's videos especially are really good. And I know that some of these videos might seem a little redundant, perhaps, because they kind of say the same thing over and over. But I do mean it when I say that this week's videos are especially good. I think they do a really good job. There's one video on leadership ethics, and then integrity ethics defined. This is a very short one. The servant leadership video is really good. So hope you enjoy that one. And then there's the authentic leadership video, which I think you're also going to really enjoy. Okay? So please watch those videos. And again, for the authentic leadership, see table 6.2 and the summary of value-based theories. Okay, so here you're going to be looking at, for example, moral management, the duty approach. Okay, what does that mean? Authentic positive leadership, spiritual leadership, servant leadership, transformational or transforming, and adaptive leadership. So these concepts we have kind of discussed already, and the book, the Van Wart text, has also discussed them. But leadership is leadership is one of those professions, or one of those areas of studies, those disciplines that can be analyzed from various different perspectives, and it has so many layers and applications and dimensions and manifestations of leadership that we don't get enough. Okay, there's never enough ways to illustrate, okay, a leadership concept or a role or an element about a particular theory, etc. Okay, so these are the videos. Now, let's talk a little bit about some of these concepts that we have been talking about, and I hope I can illustrate some of these in an enlightening way for you. So here we go. So some thoughts on ethic-based leadership. All right, so you're going to read, I'm sure you're gonna have you're gonna make your own assessments and analyses about the readings, but here's how I kind of summarize, how I bring it together. It comes down to intent, consequences, and duty. Okay, it comes down to what are your intentions? Okay, do the ends really justify the means? And then how does the character and virtue of individuals shape our moral compass, if you will? Okay, so it comes down to these three questions. So let's talk first a little bit about intent. So what were your intentions? Ask yourself the next time you are faced with a decision at work. For example, you might be faced with having to let go of one or two uh, workers, one or two of your team members because of budget cuts, for example. So, what what are your intentions for choosing one versus the other? How are you making those decisions? If you chose to pursue um, option A, let's say aside from this first example, say you were looking at two different projects, um, and you chose project A over project B. Why? Ask yourself that question. Or ask yourself about perhaps your superior, your supervisor, or the boss, or whomever, or even a presidential candidate or somebody that's in office, a president, a vice president. Why did they choose such an action? Why did they go about that route? Why did they do that? Okay, and that's important because once you come to terms with your intentions, what were your intentions to begin with? What were their intentions to begin with? Then you can begin to determine whether the spirit of the action is ethical or not. Because in many cases, we are going to have the best intentions for things that don't necessarily turn out to be the best. Our actions might have all the good intentions, but they might end up with really poor consequences or less than favorable or even sometimes tragic consequences, right? So we have to understand what those intentions are, and be true to them, right? If our intentions were good and we ended up making the wrong decision, then are we prepared to live with it? And if we are to live with it, then so be it, right? Because the intention was the right one. So that's important when to understand ethics-based leadership. What are your intentions? Okay. The second one is consequences. All right, because now we separate intentions from consequences. Okay. Do the ends justify the means? Anytime we talk about consequences, we're talking about consequential ethics or consequentialism. Okay. Or sometimes referred to as utility-based or utilitarianism, utilitarian ethics, where the end justifies the means. If you think about utilitarianism, the names Jeremy Bentham, John Stuart Mill, um, I'm drawing a blank here, but Bentham, Mill, the idea that the ends justify the means, the greater good for the greater number, so to speak. So you drop a bomb somewhere because that's going to end the war, right? One of the most discussed and controversial decisions in the history of humanity, for all intents and purposes, is whether the U.S. Should have dropped the bomb in Nagasaki and Hiroshima to end World War II, right? If you look at it from a utilitarian perspective, right, where the ends justify the means, making this decision was based on a utilitarian approach, a utilitarian decision where the United States figured that it was the right decision to prevent a further loss of life, and continuing the war, etc. So this is whether the decision was the right one or the wrong one or ethical or not would depend on what kind of lens you are looking through. In this case, if you're looking at it from a utilitarian lens, right, where the end justifies the means, then it would be considered an ethical decision. On the other hand, if you look at it from a deontological approach, okay, deontology, which is Kantian ethics, Immanuel Kant, okay, Immanuel Kant, Kantian ethics is doesn't concern itself with the end justifying the means. According to Kant, it's all about duty. It's based on duty. Duty is in Greek is dios. That's where deontology comes from. Dios, which is duty. And so, was it the right thing to do? Was it the right thing? Is it your duty to do the right thing? And did you pursue that action based on that duty? And if it was, then regardless of the consequence, regardless of the action, you did the right thing, and it was therefore an ethical decision. So here we have intent, we have consequences, we have duty. Okay, was it the right thing to do? Okay, so how do you determine a decision to be ethical or not? Well, the answer would be that it depends on the lens that you look through. If you look at it from a deontological perspective, if it's the right thing to do no matter the consequences, then it's the right thing, then it's ethical. If you look at it from a utilitarian perspective, then it would depend on the consequences to determine whether the action was ethical or not. Okay? And then the last one is virtue ethics. Virtue ethics is all about how the character and virtue of an individual shape the moral compass. Okay? So if you are a righteous person, if you are a person that, for example, a Christian who follows Christian values and a Christian way of life, your actions are going to be shaped by your Christian worldview, right? And so virtue ethics tells us that depending on the type of person you are will determine the decisions that you make and whether they are virtuous or not, whether they are ethical or not, depending on the type of person you are. So it's a little bit of a limited theory because it suggests that if a person is virtuous, then those decisions that the person makes are also going to be virtuous. On the other hand, if a person is not, then those decisions are likely not to be virtuous. So kind of a limited perspective. But at the end of the day, when you think about ethics-based leadership, ask yourself these questions. What are the intentions? Do the ends justify the means? And how does the character of my decision, how is it shaped on my moral compass? Okay. So ultimately, all three concern good intent, proper means, and appropriate ends. Okay. These must be functioning for good leadership as a process to be robust. Okay, so good intent, proper means. That means that the actions and the way about you doing things is the right way, and appropriate ends. Now, again, very subjective because what is appropriate? Who determines what is appropriate, right? So, but these are questions for you to ponder, of course. So these are some thoughts on ethics-based leadership. Now, what are some of the mechanisms that support ethical leadership? Well, several mechanisms that we have at our disposal, but if you look at some of the key ones, the three most common hallmarks of integrity are honesty, trustworthiness, and fairness. So think about these three elements that act as mechanisms. And what do we mean by mechanisms? Well, we mean that they support, they drive, they enhance, they create the opportunity for things to take place, or they promote certain behavior. Okay, so when we think about honesty, all right, the first level is telling the truth in all oral and written expression. Okay, so this idea is very simple. The truth is the best policy, right? Honesty is the best policy. Tell the truth. Don't lie. Don't lie in written word. Don't lie in oral word, right? No fibbing, okay? No exaggerations, which we sometimes, unfortunately, we do, right? Sometimes we exaggerate. Sometimes we hyperbolize. Sometimes we will say things out of frustration or resentment, or for whatever reason we might say things that are not necessarily true, right, about another person, uh, this is if you do that, then we're not being honest, right? So and everyone, I'm sure, at some point in our lives we've told a lie. He who is without sin, let him cast the first stone, right? So it's understandable. All right, we're all sinners, but it's a work in progress that we should strive to try and be as truthful with ourselves, with others, with our actions, with our intentions, right? Understanding too that anything that we say or do has consequences and can affect others in very, very important ways. So that's the first, on honesty. The second element of integrity is related to trustworthiness. Okay, so how do we make ourselves trustworthy? Okay, the best mechanism, or the most effective mechanism for trust building, for creating trust between an employer and an employee, a leader and a follower, is transparency. Okay, so accountability, transparency, these are the vehicles through which we generate trust, we create trust. So if one is transparent with your team, letting them know, how things are, what are your intentions, what are the expectations for the role of the leader, the role of the follower, the team, etc. The more transparent and the more accountable you are to your team, the greater the chances that you will build trust within the team and among the team. Okay, so trust building, okay, and being trustworthy is important. Being trustworthy is following through on commitments. Okay, when we follow through on commitments, we become reliable. People can expect things from us. If we say to somebody, look, if you do this job right, I'm going to consider you for that general manager position or that vice president position, or I'm going to promote you to team leader. If you offer that, you need to come through. You need to be accountable for that, because the minute you offer something and you don't come through, you don't do what you're supposed to do and what you're saying that you're going to do, that's the end. Your team will never trust you. They will never rely on you. They simply will stop believing what you say. And once you have lost the credibility of your team, it's very hard to recuperate it. Okay? The third one is integrity. The third element of integrity is fairness. Okay, this implies knowing and following rules that apply to all. So here we have fairness in three senses: in the institutional sense, in the operational sense, and in the distributive sense. When we think about fairness, we should think about, are we behaving in a fair manner? Are we treating our subordinates fairly? Are we assigning value, assigning credit fairly? Are we assigning blame fairly? Are we compensating individuals fairly? When we talk about compensation, we're talking about distributive fairness, right? Is the distribution of the wealth and the assets of the company and the compensation and remuneration, is it fair? Am I discriminating based on age or sex or sexual orientation or race? Right? There's obviously there's laws that prevent this practice, but it does happen. It does take place in our workforce, and so you have to be looking at fairness through an institutional lens. Is the institution fair? Do we promote the right values? Do we promote fairness, equity, inclusion? Right? Is it operationally fair, whereas everybody has the same access to things within the organization or the agency, right? Do we have the right mechanisms? Do we provide for all of the legal or institutional mechanisms that allow people to, say, seek out a promotion or seek out a better position or get support for insurance or schooling, whatever. Okay, whatever the case may be. This is operational, and then of course distributive, which is, are we distributing the resources in the institution, in the organization, in the company in a fair manner? Okay, so these are the mechanisms that support ethical leadership. Now, turning the page a little bit here, we talk about charismatic leadership. So I'm sure that you recognize these four gentlemen in the picture. Okay, we have President Reagan, President Obama, President Trump, and President Kennedy. Okay. I have chosen these, and I could have chosen a set of four others, right? But I chose these. President Trump, because he was the recent president. President Obama, the same. And then the two, President Kennedy and President Reagan, not so recent, but these four men, and of course, you might have your own personal opinion about them. And about each of them. Some people might love them, some people might not care too much about them. But whatever the reason, you cannot argue that each of them, in their own unique way, possessed what we call charisma. Okay? Charisma. And charisma comes from the Greek word that means the gift of having God's grace. It's used in a religious context, but it suggests that you have something special. And again, it may not necessarily be manifested in the best way in all of these individuals, right? We'll just leave it at that, right? Each of us have our own viewpoints on how we evaluate and what things we like about a person or not. But what is important here is that there is something that these individuals have, and all charismatic leaders have. There is something special. Sometimes we don't even know what it is, but it's special, and it could be bad. It could even be evil. In the case of somebody like Adolf Hitler, for example, who was very charismatic, even though he was very, very evil, right? So there is something special about a charismatic leader that makes them special and thus more prone for people to follow them. It puts them in a position it's almost like they create a critical mass around them. They entice you to listen to them, to follow them, to be preoccupied with them. Okay, and in some cases, to admire them, to really admire them, as is the case with some of the individuals here, no doubt about it. Okay, we think about, for example, John F. Kennedy, his untimely and tragic death still resonates in 60 some years later, and people are still in love with Camelot and the young president, the first Catholic president, and of course Jackie, which we'll see here in a minute. So there's a charisma that these individuals have, okay, that makes them special. And I guess the question here is that why I like them, or is that why I follow them? Meaning, would I follow them? Would I like them? Would I agree with them if they didn't have that? And that's a question that we need to ask sometimes when we think about a leader, because it's important to be charismatic, and charismatic leaders like President Obama, for example, whether you like him or not, whether you agreed with him or not, you cannot question that he had great charisma. I mean, he was a likable guy. He's just a great smile, really, came off down to earth. He had a sense of humor. Same with President Reagan. Folks back in the 80s used to, I grew up in the 1980s in the U.S. with President Reagan, and it was hard, even if you didn't like him, whether you liked him or not, but even his enemies and people across the aisle, the Democrats, they found it very hard to not like President Reagan. And the media liked President Reagan because he was such a charming man. He was charismatic. He was a great storyteller. He made great jokes. These men used humor. At least two of them used humor a lot here when they spoke, and that made them very, very down to earth, right? It made people laugh. It made the media laugh. There was jokes. There was always a joke. If any time President Reagan spoke, this is a strategy. This is a tactic that he used to his benefit, right? To disarm his enemies and make them much more prone and open to accept him and agree with him, even if they didn't necessarily. Okay, so, and at the same thing with President Obama. Okay, so charismatic leadership. Charismatic leaders are willing to articulate their bold notions of how things could be. Again, sometimes those articulations may come across as a little rude, a little strong, right? But nonetheless, they are willing to articulate those bold notions. They want to lead others to a better future. So they have this idea. They believe that they are special. They believe that they have a God-given talent and a God-given gift, which can be dangerous, right? In the extreme case of Hitler, where you believe that you are the chosen one and that you must change the course of human history, right? So it can also lead you into some very dark places. Okay, they have an opposition to the status quo. Okay, so they are willing to be perceived by many, at least initially, as unconventional. And this is one of the reasons why I decided to include President Trump here, because if there was one thing about President Trump that people can agree on, is that he was an outsider. He was certainly not cut from the same mold of presidents, right? This is a businessman who came from the outside, and again, his whole idea about draining the swamp and all those things, right? Whether you disagree or agree, it was bold, it was different, it was controversial in many ways. This is the tweeting president, right? And so these are examples of how charismatic leaders might sometimes they can push the norm. They can change things. They can do extraordinary things that others before them may not have done. And this is inspiring, and for some people, they actually find this as the reason for following them. Okay. Their advocacy is so passionate that they are willing to take personal risks. So again, these are leaders that whose advocacy is so passionate that they're willing to take personal risks or make personal sacrifices. They're willing to do things differently, proposing values that are different from those that have prevailed. Right? Change the status quo, change perspectives, shift paradigms. You've heard maybe that expression thrown around in the past, but that's what these individuals do, right? Think about JFK, for example, when he spoke about ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country, right? These words still resonate, right? To change the way that we as citizens react and act respective to our government, right? It's a different way of life, or a different worldview, a different perspective. Okay, so this is charismatic leadership. It's also based on the leader's passion, confidence, and exceptional ability to persuade and sway others. So when you're talking about charismatic leadership, you're talking about individuals who really believe that they are persuasive and that they can persuade and that they can influence others in a great way. Okay, so again, not to say that charismatic leadership should be construed as negative. Absolutely not. It is a really important aspect of leadership, and it's very strong and powerful leadership. The one caution that I have on charismatic leadership is whether you follow the person, if you are a charismatic leader, or if you consider leadership to be something that requires to be charismatic, which many folks do, ask yourself this question: are you following the person really because of the values and the great leader that person is, or are you just simply reacting to the charisma that person possesses, right? So that's a question that we need to ask ourselves when we follow somebody, because often people fall in love with leaders or with people in general, and they may not know why they follow them. They just follow them blindly, and that can be dangerous, right? As we have seen in history, for example, in the horrible case of Adolf Hitler in Nazi Germany. Now, turning on to a lighter type of leadership is informal leaders. And here we have two wonderful, tremendously important leaders of the 20th century. We have two former First Ladies. The first one is Eleanor Roosevelt, and the second one is Jacqueline Kennedy. First one was FDR's, Franklin Delano Roosevelt's wife, and the second one is, of course, JFK's wife. So these two wonderful and very important individuals, very important leaders, can be considered informal leaders. Now, why are they informal leaders and not formal leaders? Well, they are informal because neither of them was in a formal position to delegate authority or to exert power or control. Formally, that is. But informally, we do know from history and from our having studied them and knowing their lives, that they were very powerful and they exerted tremendous influence, not only in their husbands, but also in the country and throughout the world. Their legacy is tremendous. Their legacy is of great leadership and of tremendous accomplishments for both in their own right. Informal leadership acknowledges the reality that formal leaders do not have all the power, and they sometimes, leaders without hierarchical authority are nonetheless critical decision makers. So an informal leader in an agency or in an organization is somebody that may not necessarily be in that hierarchy. So you may not have the chief of staff and then the two subordinates, etc. You may not be in there, but you may be on the side and exert influence and power or control, because you are informally not in the formal structure, but you do have that ability, or you are in a position to have influence over somebody. So that's what informal leaders are. They are those who lack formal positions but nonetheless influence others, no matter whether they support formal leaders or not. They have the capacity to act as sources of influence separate from formal leaders. Okay? They can curb the corrosive effects of the power of formal leaders. They provide fresh ideas, communicate, ensure that employee and alternative perspectives are properly considered. So they serve as kind of an opportunity for the leader to bounce back ideas, to have a collective leadership situation, or act like as a collective leader or dual leader role, where the formal leader and the informal leaders are able to talk about certain things, certain decisions, to come up with the most desirable outcome, the most desirable decision. Obviously, all first ladies in the United States have been in that position of informal leaders to be great influences on their husbands. And that's important. And that's why the role of the First Lady, aside from her formal role as First Lady, and most of them engage in charity, and they have certain projects, etc. But the most important role of the First Lady is as that informal source of influence on her husband. I hope very soon, one day, we will have a first gentleman who will serve as an influential source on a potential and eventual first woman president. So, and that'll be interesting to see the dynamic of that leadership relationship between the formal and the informal. Okay, now, followership. All right, so we've talked about followership so far, not in great lengths, but we have discussed it. There are some theories. What is followership? Essentially, well, followership is leadership from below, okay? It's how do I, as a follower, in a position of a follower, not in a position of a leader, okay? How do I exert leadership? How do I produce value? How do I add value, okay? So this is what followership is about. Now, followership is not without its flaws or risks and downsides, okay? Because followers can be very influential, and they can have a very important role in supporting and promoting sound leadership. But they can also, act as in detriment to the leader. Okay, they can they have the power to get somebody removed out of office. Okay, they have the power to accuse somebody of wrongdoing, maybe unfairly so. They have a lot of power. If you think about a situation or a scenario where the leader's power comes from its followers, that is a very delicate balance, because the leader knows that once she or he loses his or her followers, you've got nothing. You've got nothing left. Okay? So followers not only can change leaders who are elected, but also can topple leaders by lack of support. Okay? Coup d'etats, we've seen these throughout history, right? Open resistance, right? Open resistance, whether formal, informal, through the media, through the different government channels, right, and the institutional channels, right? Things like impeachment, right? We didn't talk about impeachment as much as we have over the last 10 years. Impeachment, as the founding fathers intended for it to be, was a last source, was a last resort for removing a tyrannical president. It seems, however, that over the last few years, it's become almost a policy tool, where it's just every single president that comes into office is now having to deal with impeachment threats, right? And so this is an example where if you are a leader who achieves the presidency, and your source of power comes from your followers, or at least in some part, you run the risk, if you don't agree with them, if you don't do what they want you to do, or go in the direction that they want you to go to, you might run the risk of being impeached, right? And so this type of open resistance, this type of toppling, right? And even sabotage, okay? This is why when we talk about certain mechanisms or certain practices, like, for example, there's one called guerrilla government, which is basically another term for whistleblowing. Whistleblowing is important. Whistleblowing should be a practice that is accepted and encouraged to keep wrongdoing from taking over an agency, to punish those that are not following the rules, etc. However, we should also be careful with things like whistleblowing, because whistleblowing, if done with the wrong intent, remember we talked about intent just a few minutes ago, can be a source of sabotage, can sabotage somebody, can be revenge, can be a source of revenge, can be used for political gains, even though it's not for political gains and not necessarily for righteous gains, right? So these are some fine lines that we have to walk through as ethical leaders and as ethical followers. There's 5 types of followers, generally speaking. These are based on their level of engagement, and we have the isolated follower, who is often alienated. Then you have, if you're a follower that's a bystander, you're conceived or perceived as passive. So you're just kind of going with the flow, just checking things out. Then there are those that are participants. These are pragmatic followers, and they are very smart. They understand scenarios, they understand risks, and so they're very good at managing all of these different risks and scenarios, etc. And they are active participants. Then you have the activists. The activists are the ones that are with the signs and the lobbying and stuff. These are we call these exemplary, or we refer to them as exemplary, because for a leader, these are the exemplary followers. These are the ones that are going to go the extra mile for you, right? And they're going to be the ones in the front lines trying to promote your vision, all right? And then you have the diehards, and the diehards are the crackerjack, right? The superstars followers. But then you also can have these superstar diehards that are great at promoting and supporting you and believing in you and championing your cause. But you can also have the foe, right? You can have the really antagonistic, right? The enemy that's going to fight you no matter what, because they simply don't like you, okay? If somebody doesn't like X-president or Y-president or whomever, they're just simply going to do everything they can to see that downfall of that person. And then lastly, you have the sheeple, right? The sheeple, which is a term that we use these days to refer to people and sheep, right? The sheeple who just simply follow blindly. They have no clue. They just simply follow, and that's it, okay? So this concludes our discussion for today. I hope that you enjoyed it. Thank you very much for taking the time to listen to our lecture. Have a great week. As always, please let me know if there's anything that I can do to help you and support you. If not, enjoy the week. Thank you very much.